Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Sarah Buck. I'm the Chief Programs Officer at RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, who is one of the many roads partners that you'll be hearing from today. So you are here for the following webinar, The Power of Rural Collaboration and Coalition Building, Lessons Learned and Path Forward. Thank you again for being here. I'm just going to briefly mention a few of the key partners that are a part of this great initiative and give a quick introduction of my organization, as well as an overview of what we're going to be discussing today, and then pass it on to all of our speakers. So the Roads Partnership is something that has been happening for a number of years, but here is a great graphic of all of our partners. We have the Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group, Rural LISC, the Federal Reserve Board, Housing Assistance Council, RCAP, and then the International Economic Development Council, who you'll be hearing from all except for the Federal Reserve Board today. Let's see. So a little bit more about today's agenda. So first off, I'm going to just share a little bit about how did we get here and why are we here? Next, we're going to talk about capacity building needs in rural communities across the U.S., and then some of the successes that we've seen in rural. And Aspen and HAC are going to share some of their on-the-ground experiences on that front. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about non-traditional collaboration and how key that is for our rural communities at the local level, the regional level, and the national level. And Rural LISC is going to cover that piece for us. Next up, we're going to talk more about coalition building, advocacy, and the Farm Bill, which some of you might have heard of before, some of you might have been part of, and RCAP as well as IEDC are going to cover that piece. And then we're going to have a conclusion and talk a little bit about where we go from here now that we've laid the great groundwork of this partnership. And then we're going to have some time for question and answer from the audience. So a little bit about where we have been. Again, we are the Rural Opportunity and Development Partnership, and we have these sessions that we've been doing over the last couple of years. We came together from a diverse set of organizations that really care about rural. Some of us are much more experienced in infrastructure, others in lending, others in housing, others in economic development. But really, we need all of these things to be able to have thriving rural communities. So because of that, we all came together in this partnership to have a virtual series that was really in response to COVID, which we know changed all of our worlds and rocked them for quite some time. And although, we're coming out of that, we still sort of live in this hybrid existence. So we have been continuing that partnership thanks to this great support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So we will be able to share out a copy of this PowerPoint afterwards, and we are recording it. But there is a link here to a little bit more about the background of this partnership. And then also on Aspen CSG's website, there are blog posts and recordings from all of the many sessions that we have been doing over the last year that have been hosted by all of the various partners. So a little bit more about why we're here and where we're coming from. But this partnership was really, developed to highlight and unpack rural development, really break down those silos in response to COVID-19, long-term rebuilding and recovery, sustainability. The sessions that we've done so far have featured, intermediary organizations like all of ours, as well as the communities themselves and on-the-ground practitioners who have so much experience to share. So hopefully you all have been able to see some of those, but if you haven't, highly recommend going to the website, reading the blog posts, checking those out. But we really also emphasize the diversity of rural America. Rural America is so different, and we really want to celebrate that uniqueness, and also serving rural America is nuanced because of that. But there are both assets and challenges, and really our mutual goal is to lift up those voices and lived experience to make positive change. So You probably have maybe heard of RCAP before. I'm just going to do a really brief introduction, and then I'm going to pass it over to Chris from Aspen. So the Rural Community Assistance Partnership is a national network of nonprofits. There are 7 that cover the entire United States and the U.S. territories and tribal lands. But we have, for the last 50 years, been providing training, technical assistance, and capacity building to small, rural, and tribal communities in water, wastewater, solid waste, and also helping to create economic opportunity so that rural communities can be equitable, so that they can be sustainable, and so that they can thrive. And with that, I will hand things over to Chris.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. So a little bit about Aspen CSG. We are the Community Strategies Group is a program of the Aspen Institute, which is an organization that has been around since 1947. We were formed as a program in 1985. The history of the Institute is really centered around convening people to learn from one another and discuss and engage those learnings back into their work. Our work was really centered on a couple of principles of peer learning within folks doing the work in rural communities, lifting up those voices and synthesizing that learning for the field itself, but also for major systems like government and philanthropy to try to improve the way those entities were investing and supporting rural places, and thinking about that work from an asset-based, equity-centered, holistic perspective, and with a special emphasis on regionalism. We shorthand that as sort of doing rural development differently. Our work over that time for 29 of those years was led by Janet Topolsky. Benita Robertson Hardy and I came on in 2021 and became co-directors in 22 when Janet retired. So we've been excited to be a part of the Roads Partnership. And again, I think while this may seem and then has been an easy and enjoyable collaboration, I think that it's important to note that national organizations don't always collaborate well with one another. And I think over the history of rural development, there hasn't always been this level of partnership. And so it's a great credit to all of these organizational leaders and the folks who have participated that we've been able to do that. I also want to note it's great to see so many of you on. I think we're over 220 folks on at the moment, and to see all the places and names from in the chat, and especially for me, having moved to DC from North Carolina, to see so many North Carolina folks there. I'll talk briefly about the capacity building work that, this is difficult in some ways because capacity building has been an identified issue in rural for a long time. This isn't as though we just recently discovered this issue. And we've been trying, along with many of the partners here, to bring this issue to the forefront. CSG, I think about capacity building in sort of 2 large buckets. There's organizational capacity building, which is sort of what organizations often need in rural spaces that don't have a lot of funding opportunities and have a lot of challenges. And then there's community, what we think of as sort of community capacity. And within the organizational setting, I hope you all had a chance to see our Funding Rural Futures report. Tyler, if you can put that in the chat for folks, is a summary of learnings around the organizational needs for greater flexibility in funding and reliability in funding. Rural places often experience much more episodic funding as people kind of pop in and out, or even federal and state funding often tends to be cyclical in the sense that it may be coming, they're not able to rely on that year to year. And there's a lot of equity concerns in that about who's getting invested in and what communities are really being served, that I think is finally really coming to the forefront with the Biden administration's efforts to get a lot of funding to rural places and recognizing that the capacity of those communities and regions just has not been able to both apply for or digest that funding. We have continued to do webinars as part of Roads and in other ways about this issue, and we'll be continuing to do that. And so you'll hear more about this in the sort of wrap-up section. At the community level, there's also this sense the capacity issue is sort of broader. It obviously includes organizations and local governments, but it has a lot more to do with how planning and visioning is done in bringing people's ensuring, if you go to our Thrive Rural framework, ensuring that both all voices are included and with intentionality and value, but that the design process of what the community is trying to do is a shared vision, and that it's designing for everyone to thrive in that work. And that too often in rural, because community capacity isn't always as strong, there's not enough effort on sort of building trust and sharing experiences to overcome some of the past trauma or past difficulties in communities and regions. And that it's very hard to sort of drop in and say, hey, you guys should get together and do an application for this community-wide investment, this major opportunity. And so that pre-work is really important. And it has a lot of both, a part of that element is, I mentioned earlier, asset-based focused development. The initial stage of that is really understanding all of the assets or capitals that a community has. The WealthWorks framework, which was a sort of open source framework that was developed with CSG and a number of other practitioners over a number of years, and is currently being hosted, a cohort being hosted and led by Melissa Levy, who's a consultant with NATO, the National Association of Development Organizations, is really trying to help folks understand what it's like to try to do this work on the ground. But those sense of community capitals is where all that work starts, and really recognizing all the resources we have in our community and how to then plan and include them in both the ideas and visioning of where the community needs to go. As part of that, I wanted to share one other resource that we have developed in the chat with everyone, which is a community capacity playbook that was developed a few years ago, capacity building workbook by Janet Topolsky in a 2-year community of practice that really is designed to help people understand what goes into assessing community capacity and the steps that need to be taken. Now, I'll close by saying this issue is very pertinent to today. It's going to come up in both Penny's discussion and in Ted's discussion because of the current opportunities within the Farm Bill. As I said earlier, the efforts to get funding out the door and recognizing that capacity is a challenge has led to some recognition by congressional leaders of both parties. The challenge is that politicians, and particularly at the federal level, people often think of capacity only in the terms of, do you have the capacity to apply for and receive federal funding? And while that's important and certainly something that communities need to be able to do, we want to ensure that investing in capacity is deeper than that and has a more inclusive and equity-centered approach to it. So with that, I am going to turn it over to, I think, Ted. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so, Chris.
Sorry, guys, not yet.
I missed one.
We need to hear from Hack and Rural
Sorry,
LISC. It's
Sean
okay.
Terry, I apologize.
So we'll turn it over to Shantaria.
I am getting my, let's see, making sure I have everything turned on. All right, perfect. Thank you so much. No worries, Chris. I appreciate you. So as Sarah said, I am Shantaria Charleston. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance here at the Housing Assistance Council. And so I want to just provide a really quick high-level summary about the Housing Assistance Council in terms of who we are, why we do what we do, and then how we do what we do, and then talk a little bit more about capacity building in rural places and thinking of the challenges and some of the opportunities that exist for capacity building in rural areas. Chris did a wonderful job of explaining capacity building, so I don't want to repeat anything, but I am going to touch on a few more points that I want to raise. So a little bit about the Housing Assistance Council. We are a national nonprofit TA intermediary and community development finance institution with a mission to improve housing conditions for the rural poor, with an emphasis on the poorest of the poor in the most rural places. And so with our mission focused on the poorest of the poor in the most rural places, HAC gives special attention to several areas and populations, which include Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, the Southwest Border Colonias region, Indian country, farm workers, and veterans. And so thinking about that mission, to meet our mission, we utilize a four-pronged approach, and this is really how we have our business lines established. The first is by providing specialized training and direct technical assistance aimed at building both the organizational and development capacity of nonprofit organizations. Second is through extensive information provided through research on housing and policy data that informs sound housing decisions. Thirdly, that pairs well with our research and information is through policy interpretation. It really is supported by the data that informs, influences, and promotes a strong, effective, and supportive government role in rural affordable housing. And lastly, the fourth prong is really through providing upfront access to low-cost capital that many small rural nonprofits face challenges accessing. And so it is through these combined approaches, or the four combined approaches, that HAC seeks to impact three key outcomes. The first is improved quality of life for rural residents. The second is shared prosperity. And last but certainly not least is thriving communities built around healthy and sustainable systems. So kind of doubling down on what Chris said earlier, capacity building from where we sit at HAC, it looks different depending upon where you are, and it's not always easily quantifiable. Again, like Aspen, HAC looks at capacity building in two separate buckets. The first bucket, we look at organizational capacity. And this is really about having strong organizations that are not only appropriately funded, because when we think about, the capacity and resources, we think of funding, but these are organizations that are not only appropriately funded, but are also adequately staffed to support and respond to the needs and challenges in their communities. So that organizations are structured in such a way that they are self-sustaining over time. And this is really looking at ensuring that organizations can survive beyond a technical assistance or a capacity building engagement. And so we really hone in on trying to make sure that organizations are equipped with the appropriate systems, practices, and policies so that they can be responsive and resilient over time. I think it's also important to note that organizational capacity, like anything else, has periods of where groups, they ebb and flow. You might have a really strong group that's doing really well, producing a larger number of units, and they might undergo a leadership transition, or God forbid, they lose a key staff person. They oftentimes have additional need for capacity building on the organizational side. And so really it is around building the capacity so that groups can actually be prepared and responsive to those type situations. The second piece that we look at, or the second bucket, is really the developmental capacity of rural nonprofits. And because our work in rural America happens through partners that are nonprofit organizations, it really is important that nonprofit organizations fully understand how housing development or the affordable housing development process really works. And so making sure that they understand that every situation will probably be different. There's an old saying that old housers used to say, it's like if you've been to one rural community, you've been to one rural community. There are different capacity needs. You can be in two different communities, yet have the same capacity need, but have different outcomes based on what the actual capacity need is. And so we really work with groups to identify the problem. And so on the slide that's showing on the screen, the large umbrella problem that we are trying to focus on at HAC is really addressing poverty and inequity in rural communities. Then our goal is, of course, to empower organizations so that they are sustainable and resilient over time. And then because the way that we impact rural America is through the nonprofit, we always look at the critical role of the nonprofits and that they play in rural areas. And then there's, of course, and I won't go through them all one by one, the interventions. We're looking at the outputs and the outcomes as well as the impacts. And so want to make sure that I note that the outputs, the outcomes, and the impacts, again, will look as different as rural communities look. And so we've seen a couple of different challenges, or so to speak, or opportunities, as we like to call them. We know that rural communities often have, smaller investments or lack of investments when, considered against larger places or more urbanized communities. There's also, too, the lack of scale in the affordable housing development process, which makes rural development a little bit less attractive for-profit developers. There's also limited local capacity in terms of not just the funding capacity, but also to human capital. Typically, you have young adults, they graduate high school, they go off to college, and they move on to bigger cities doing, so many wonderful things. But here recently, and this is one of the things that we've started seeing on the ground, is where folks are returning to their communities. Young people are returning to their communities to have an impact in rural areas. And so those are some of the challenges that we've seen. If you think about some of the successes, it really goes back to the importance of the capacity building, and really capacity building. That overarching goal, we go back to the overarching goal, is to empower organizations, residents, and other stakeholders to be responsive to the challenges and needs in their own communities. Some of the successes we've seen, I think someone's going to talk about this a little bit later on, it really does center upon collaboration, and making sure that there are strategic partnerships that are established in rural areas so that nonprofits, residents, and other stakeholders have a larger voice at the table in terms of making the case for, housing needs or any other type needs in rural areas. And so I think I will stop there. I don't want to boil over into anyone else's presentation, but I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, we will move into collaboration and welcome Emily.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. I'm filling in today for our fearless leader, Nadia Viagran, who had a family emergency. So thanks for popping us in at the last minute, and hopefully I can do her justice here. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about non-traditional collaborations, which, if you know much about Rural LISC, you know that is really the bread and butter of what we do. LISC is one of the largest CDFIs across the country. And the way I always describe it to people who don't quite understand community development is when you think about anything it takes to run a community, whether it's small business development or Main Street development, affordable housing, LISC is involved in almost every way. And really what we're looking at is how do we take a comprehensive approach to the way rural communities do community development. We take best practices from across our 150 rural partner network, and we try and create those proven model examples that we can really take into other communities and help them really see, you know, what have we learned in other communities and how can it best be implemented in your own rural community, obviously with the flexibility that really meets the culture of your own rural community. So I'll talk a little bit about the presentation or the road session that was done as it related to collaboration. If you want to move to the next slide, Sarah. The session that was done was really focused around broadband and digital equity. This is one of the areas that right now is particularly important to bring those national and local level collaborations. As there's more and more funding becoming available, there's a lot of interest in the topic, and there's a lot of people who care about really bringing this to rural communities. And so there's a session recording on the website. There's also a link to the blog that we can put in chat here in a minute. On the next slide I pull out a quote from this blog that is from one of my favorite collaborators, Jerry Kenny, who's with the TLL Temple Foundation in Texas. And he just has a really great way of looking at non-traditional collaborations and really, you know, taking the approach that everybody has something to add. And it's really worth bringing in a lot of those national partnerships that really can bring attention to these local communities in some cases that have really never gotten that attention and kind of have been forgotten about. And when you're partnering with some of those larger national entities, again, you're really not only bringing attention, but you're putting it on the radar of those organizations to then, you know, bring more resources, bring more funding, bring best practices to that community, and really, again, kind of create this, you know, from local to national level collaboration that really can, you know, find the best way forward with some of these programs. So that entry points and no dead ends. I love the no dead ends point. I think, you know, when I think about the how, which I'll talk about in just a second, I think that's probably the simplest way to really put it. And when we think about the why is a non-traditional collaboration important at all levels? You know, I've been with Rural LISC. I'm the director of alignment here, which I probably should have said at the beginning, but I've been here for about 5 years. And what I know today is that there is more interest in serving rural communities than I've ever seen in the past. And when you ask, when you try to collaborate and find the answers, it's out there. People have money right now. People have money that they want to invest in rural communities. And people also care about capacity building, right? I mean, you saw how many times that topic was brought up on the call just today. That topic is getting more and more traction, which is really important if we're going to deploy new resources, new dollars into rural communities. We really do have to make sure that those communities are ready for that level of investment. And so, again, when you think about, you know, why, you know, I have so much to do. I'm thinking of all the things that are right in front of me. Why should I step outside of this and start to bring in other people? Maybe it'll make it tougher, right? But the reality is even though there might be some tough spots, it might be harder. It might take more time. I mean, if you look at that quote, it really talks about this is not easy, right? Collaborating, building local, building national collaborations are not easy, but it's worth it. And one of my favorite stories to share is in actually East Texas with TLL Temple Foundation. You know, they invested in us to go in and find an organization who could become a financial opportunity center. And we're in this partnership now 6 years later, where they are bringing in tons of new resources from different funders, both local, regional, national, that are really investing in them because they see the work that they're doing. They see the need that they have. They've really put their community on the map, and the type of partners that they have in the community on the map. And it's really turning around and bringing in a number of new resources, a number of best practices. And, again, it really does end up paying off in the end. And so the other thing I would say is, again, I think I love innovation. And innovation is really important and really great. But the reality is again, as you think about kind of opening the door to new partners and new collaborations, there are lessons learned across all of the 150 communities that we're in. And we're continuing to bring those forward to really make sure that people who are interested in kind of opening the door to new ideas are able to really learn from those lessons learned and learn from those best practices. So I think I have one slide left I'll share, and I know I only have a few minutes. So Jerry Kenny had beautiful quotes, and Krista Vincent is the one that you'll see did that road session, and she is also a master collaborator, and probably really should be on talking to you all right now, but I would strongly encourage reaching out and looking at that. And this is my very expert level advice to you. I like to keep it simple. And again, the reality is if you do not ask, you will not open that door, right? And there are a lot of people right now out in communities at the local, state, regional, national level that really do want to get involved in rural communities and really help solve for some of these issues. And if you ask, whether it's within your local community where you're pulling people together and just starting to see who knows who, or you're bringing in, you're Googling, all jokes aside, Google didn't pay me to say this, but if you don't know where to start, Google it, right? The people who are on this call today gave incredible resources, and they're available for free to all of you to really start thinking about how do we start to bring light to what we're doing in our community and bring new partnerships and new organizations to take a look at what we need or what we're doing and how we can really take it to the next level. So that's my absolute best advice, is to ask for collaboration, ask what people are doing, ask if they're interested, and to Google it if you don't know where to start. And I guarantee you'll find something, or take a look at LISC's website. We have tons of tools and guides to how do you really start that community conversation about building collaborations that we'd be happy to point you to. So here's my contact information if you're interested in reaching out, and I'll help get you to the right people. And thanks for having us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. And next, we'll dive into coalition building, advocacy, and the Farm Bill. And we'll kick that off with Ted.
Well, I think that was a perfect segue, Emily, into actually where we can use your help and where you can ask, and to kind of talk about what we're doing. I really want to thank you all for your time today. My name is Ted Steiger. I'm the Chief External Affairs and Policy Officer for RCAP, Rural Community Assistance Partnership. Partnership is in our acronym, it's in our name. We wouldn't be able to serve close to 2,000 rural communities each year without collaboration and partnership. Sarah gave a little bit more background on RCAP, but we are a national nonprofit organization, and we do lots of rural advocacy to advance not only funding, but policy for rural America here in Washington. I've spent my entire career in Washington, but I'm from a small town of about 1,500 people. And I do want to say that Washington does not have all the greatest ideas, contrary to what Washington might think. We need folks from the ground. How are these programs working? How are they not working? What are the needs out there? What are the challenges out there? And so RCAP has helped either found or create 2 national coalitions. I'm happy to give you my email if you're interested in learning more and want to join. Obviously, coalition building is super important to what we do on the national advocacy scale. We are in what's called a Farm Bill year. We call it Farm Bill for short, but it's really the entire United States Department of Agriculture. The Farm Bill touches farms, of course, helps farmers, helps crops, but it does so much more. And we work on a small title called the Rural Development Title, which has our electric programs, our broadband programs, houses economic development, water infrastructure. USDA touches forestry, our nutrition programs. So when we say Farm Bill for short, I want to say it goes just beyond the farmer, but also supporting the economies that support our farmers, that support our rural infrastructure, that support our rural people. And so we are in a Farm Bill. Congress changes policies to USDA. They're supposed to do it every 5 years. So we've been working with Congress to make changes to USDA policy, which they do every 5 years. And so we have founded a couple of different coalitions that engage on the Farm Bill. And I know my colleague Penny is going to be following up. So I'll let her kind of talk a little bit more on the policy specifics about what we were able to do. But the first coalition, if you're interested, is called the Rural Network. We are a coalition of more than 40 organizations, both national, regional, and local, committed to just USDA rural development funding and policy. There wasn't really a space for just rural development. Some ideas came from Capitol Hill too. Congressional staff and senators and Congress people were like, we don't hear from the rural development community in a coordinated way. Could you all help with this? We need to have powers in numbers. We kind of hear from you all individually, but can you collectively organize? So we decided to do that in about 2018. So RCAP is a founding member of the Rural Network, along with the National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA, and the National Association of Counties. What are some of the priorities that we work on every year? Obviously, we work on funding for rural development, which Congress does every year. So FY25 appropriations. Mandatory money for the rural development title in the Farm Bill. What does mandatory money mean? Mandatory means real money. So we're focused on that. And I'll let Penny talk a little bit more about the Rural Partnership and Prosperity Act, which we've been able to push through a Farm Bill that would really, really help with rural capacity building that my colleagues at HAC talked about, that Emily talked about, and really try to help with rural economic development in our small towns and rural places, and in a lot of areas that have just been left out from federal funding for generations. And then we are also part of the Reimagining Rural Assistance Network, RRN. This is another coalition. I know a lot of my colleagues, Chris with Aspen, Penny as well, part of these coalitions too, of national, regional, and local organizations. The unique part of RRN is that we have national groups, policy folks, but also organizations that are deeply rooted serving rural people in places. And the focus is on all federal programs impacting rural. And where are they not working? Or where are they working? And engaging with federal agencies and the Hill to really look out for rural people in places with a focus on equity, which is extremely important. And so RCAP has been on the steering committee of that, and we assist with staffing in partnership with the Brookings Institute. Our priorities there, as you can see, Rural Partnership and Prosperity Act, which Penny's going to talk about, all various rural programs at federal agencies, including our Economic Development Administration, HUD, Small Business Administration, and obviously rural broadband deployment, which is huge. And I want to give folks my email. I don't have a slide. It's TSTIGER, Tiger with an S, at rcap.org. We are working on some really exciting things to advance federal policy, and we wouldn't be able to do that without coalitions, without partnerships, without you all. And I want to turn it over to Penny to talk about what we've been able to do in terms of Farm Bill advocacy and the Rural Partnership and Prosperity Act, because I think that is proof in the pudding why coalitions and why partnerships and why working together is extremely important to get stuff done in Washington. And so with that, I really look forward to working with all of you, and please shoot me an email if you're interested in these coalitions. I'm happy to talk more and get back to you on real action steps after this convening. So with that, back to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Ted. Really appreciate it. And without further ado, we'll turn things over to Penny.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Ted. This is a great segue. Yes, regarding our coalition building and advocacy efforts, well, first let me introduce myself formally. Again, I'm Penny Tillman. I'm the Director for Government Affairs at the International Economic Development Council. I'm here filling in for our President and CEO, Nathan Oley, who's in Spokane, Washington, attending one of our conferences. With that said, in terms of focusing on our advocacy efforts, especially regarding the Farm Bill, I would like to look at the case study for the Rural Partnerships Program provision and the 2024 U.S. Senate frameworks, both the Republican and Democratic frameworks. As Ted has mentioned, the International Economic Development Council is joined with this coalition of partners to really push forward a key provision in the 2024 Farm Bill. And fortunately, on May 1st, Debbie Stabenow, the chairwoman of the Senate Ag Committee, she did codify RPP in her legislative framework, and more so, is calling for mandatory funding, baseline funding, which is $50 million that would go towards this program, providing federal grants across a range of rural economic development programs. So this is very, very important, and it's the first of its kind. In terms of June 11th, fortunately, her Republican colleague, ranking member John Boozman, followed suit to an extent and included RPP in his legislative text for the Farm Bill for the GOP framework to start negotiations and to fortunately move forward with RPP squarely at the fore of both the Democrats and Republicans. Again, this is very important effort and steps, and I would like to take you pretty much over an overview of how this came to be to date. Next slide, please. Of course, speaking to the significance of RPP again, as Ted mentioned, in terms of the Farm Bill, it encompasses a whole range of rural economic development, infrastructure, broadband assistance. Unfortunately, the rural development title only receives less than 1% of the mandatory funding outlays to date. And so in terms of looking at it from pretty much in the contextual space, majority of the funding is afforded to the nutrition title. Of course, that's very important. However, having an RPP provision in the Farm Bill that would get funding more or less in perpetuity would be a game changer for rural economic development in terms of capacity building and being able to facilitate more investments, and as an end result, more jobs, family sustaining jobs. Next slide, please. Now, I just want to kind of give you an overview of how RPP pretty much came to be, RPP's path to inclusion in the 2024 Farm Bill. Initially in 2017, Nathan Oley, who was then the head of RCAP, had a lunch meeting with Doug O'Brien, who's NCBA's president and CEO, and they made a commitment to work together, not to have their organizations compete, but cooperate on rural development programs and giving RD a stronger voice when it comes to conversations with federal funding. And as Chris Estes said at the beginning, usually rural development organizations, they have to compete and they don't necessarily cooperate with one another. It's just due to, unfortunate, the climate in which we have to operate and fight for funding and being pretty much sidelined. However, these two gentlemen, they had a vision to bring organizations of like minds together and to consolidate our resources and our influence to be able to leverage for the greater good when it comes to rural economic development. Fortunately, both RCAP and NCBA developed a strong relationship with NACO and formed the rural network of which Ted spoke just now. As a result, all three organizations were able to actually bring on board over 80 organizations to be able, again, to scale influence and resources to move forward the conversation of RD. And pardon me, soon after, there was a launch of the Rural Innovation Summit. At the Rural Innovation Summit, that's when ideas were developing to really bring at the fore for Congress and congressional staff, including members, to really have a frank an open conversation about the needs of the rural economic development community and being able to more so move forward on the issues of capacity building. Next slide. As Ted spoke as well, the Reimagining Rural Assistance Network, RRAN, pretty much started the conversation and developed the idea of RPP as we know it today. Initially, RPP was included in the first version of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Unfortunately, the final statute did not include the provision. However, today we stand before both Republicans and Democrats on the Senate side, at least for now, to have RPP co-opted in their text and moving forward in negotiations. Now, and of course, the difference is on the Democratic side, Chairman Stabenow has included the provision for mandatory funding. Unfortunately, Ranking Member Boozman did not expressly or explicitly indicate that he's calling for mandatory funding of this particular program. However, this is an opportunity once again to coalesce around an RPP and be able to push it forward across the finish line. Next slide, please. Again, this would be an historical achievement for our partners, including IEDC. If RPP is included in the final version of this year's Farm Bill, negotiations are ongoing. It remains to be seen if there will be floor action in the 118th Congress, even during the lame duck session after the November elections. But we'll have momentum moving forward either way, either this year or moving into the 119th Congress first session. Finish.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Penny. So next up, we'll bring Chris back to really tie a bow on things about where we as a partnership go from here, and then we'll take any questions that folks have from the audience.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So part of this, the purpose of this webinar is to sort of both summarize many of the key learnings and I think connect them that have happened over the series of the Roads webinars, but also to kind of denote that this is the end of that formal webinar series. This doesn't mean that you won't be seeing other collaborative efforts. However, I think exactly the opposite, that we anticipate more collaborative partnerships with each other around specific issues and opportunities, maintaining those relationships in, I think, coherent and coordinated advocacy efforts, as Ted and Penny talked about, and thinking about how to create better alignment and support in general with the field where a lot of our work intersects on the ground. We felt like, given the sort of return from COVID, the need to have a separated webinar series that was happening 3 or 4 times a year had kind of expired, and that folks were really wanting to broaden and deepen their own organizational work, but that we would commit to really continued collaboration and partnership going forward. I do think there are some big themes that you will continue to see us all and some of us individual in particular working on for the field of equitable rural development. One is, I think, continuing to think about how we can get better measurement outcomes in government and philanthropy for measuring success in rural. The recognition that much of funding is designed around urban or suburban models, and that we have yet to sort of fully shift the awareness of how funding work in rural needs to be different and account for different capacity issues, different other funding opportunities. For example, the continuing match requirements often eliminates many rural communities that don't have other funding sources to tap into. the recognition of being able that often when rural communities are asked to compete on volume in terms of the number of people that will be impacted by a grant, often is a structural barrier rather than allowing, particularly moving towards rural set-asides that allow people to set goals on relative change. In other words, how are we going to move the needle on a particular population or an issue or an outcome relative to where we were when we started, rather than this idea of just more is better because we need to roll up those numbers to show the biggest bang for the buck. And those are some examples that I think there's still a lot of work to do in that space and continue to articulate what it looks like to really support rural folks. I think a lot of lessons from the administration's efforts to get funding to rural, obviously around capacity building, are going to continue. There's much more work to be done, regardless of what happens with the Farm Bill, both particularly with private philanthropy, to understand how national philanthropy can understand both the need and frank, the mission connection to funding efforts in rural, whether it's around concerns of equity or poverty or economic development, or the importance of rural to the democracy and the economy of the country. There's a lot more work to build there, and I think understanding how to invest in building capacity in rural serving organizations and regions that can be done effectively and show real impact, rather than, I think the predominant framework is that there's just too much need out there and people don't know where to start. I'll finally say that we are particularly interested in the way organizations work in rural and continue to lift up the model that we've centered, that we call rural development hubs. But the most important elements of this model, I think, are universal for organizations, both for the field to understand, but also funders to know that supporting organizations so that they can work collaboratively, build trust, take the long view to the work, thinking about systems change, not just one transaction at a time, building capacity, as we noted, thinking regionally, and being able to take risk. These were all elements that really came out from the field of where, when we looked at back in 2019 in our Rural Development Hubs report of like where innovation was happening, these were key characteristics. And we continue to believe that lifting up, all of us will be trying to lift up examples of what this looks like on the ground and building greater support for, again, both not just the federal government, but state and local governments as well, and philanthropy, to be both investing more, but also making that funding more accessible and usable for the work that rural organizations and communities are trying to achieve. So again, I don't want this to feel like this is the end of our partnership or the end of these kinds of discussions, but really thinking that we'll be thinking more intentionally about how to incorporate them in ongoing ways and finding ways to continue to partner together to share these learnings as we face sort of a new chapter of work, which is how we digest the learnings of the last 4 years and thinking about what's ahead for rural in many significant ways, whether it's how the issues of climate change and increased natural disaster play out in rural communities, the workforce development needs of rural communities and residents, economic opportunities, and greater ability to both access capital and invest in small business development and local wealth building, and sort of moving away from the attraction extraction models. We are particularly pleased to be that there will be a National Rural Development Summit that IEDC has been the catalyst for, Penny's organization, sometime in 2025. And we expect more of these sort of important national issues with rural to be connected and lifted up by us and others in the space. So with that, if there's any other folks on the of the speakers who want to chime in, if there's anything I forgot, I will pause and turn it over to Sarah.
Wonderful. And certainly if folks have any additional questions, we have a few that came in the Q&A box. I know a few things have been coming in the chat, but others have been answering them. But a couple things that I'm seeing here in the Q&A, just a question about the recording being shared. I know it is being recorded and it's going to be posted on Aspen CSG's Roads webpage. And I'm assuming it may also go out after to attendees. So it will be recorded and available so that you can come back to it and share with others. Also, a few other questions that we have. One came in, and I'm not sure with the acronym if you were referring to RCAP or HAC as far as having regional directors and how we connect them. But I'm going to just put in the chat, or actually, I don't think I can put it in the chat, but for RCAP, if you go to our website, rcap.org, and scroll down to the bottom, it shows our 6 regional partners that cover the various geographies across the country. And from there, you can go to their particular websites and be able to reach out to them. Or you can reach out to info@rcap.org, and we can send you, depending on where you're based, to the right organization so that you can connect with them. And I don't know, Hack, if that question was geared towards you all, what the best way to get in contact with you or your folks across the country might be.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Sarah. You can visit HAC's website, www.ruralhome.org. I will drop it in the webinar chat, and click on the tab that says what we do. Click on TA, and then there's a little tab for you to request TA.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. We have another question, and this is generally for the panelists. Are any of you doing work to cultivate rural pathways to post-secondary education?
I'll just kick off by saying part of the efforts we talk a lot about in communities trying to diversify their economies from sort of single extraction or industries is the recognition that workforce development needs to be more than just formal, college or community college, but understanding the value and utilization of certificate programs to make better job opportunities more accessible for people often transitioning from some of these industries, or people who have been sort of left behind by the economic shifts in their regions and communities. We anticipate doing more in the future in some sort of formal reports in partnership with others, and particularly those thinking about rural education. But it's a national discussion around workforce, and I know a lot of people are involved, but I think too often we've sort of defaulted to the answer is to have more people going to community college, which is certainly a great resource, but there are many folks for whom they can still advance and develop their careers by advancing their education through certificate programs and other means to educate themselves. And will be a big issue we'll be continuing trying to build on.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in. I do have one last question that I think we'll have time for, and then we'll be able to close. But this one is coming from someone in New Mexico. So Mora and San Miguel counties are recovering from massive wildfire. Reparation funds of nearly $4 billion were allocated. One of the major challenges is finding rural savvy partners in areas such as financial investment planning, developers for commercial areas planned as part of recovery, et cetera. Do you have any suggestions in this area? I don't know if any panelists want to chime in before we close.
I was actually looking to see how close the USDA Rural Partners Network footprint is in New Mexico. I was doing a quick overlay, and it looks like there might be some overlap there. So if you are not already connected to the USDA Rural Partners Network, if you go to rural.gov, there is a map of each of the states and each of the regions that they have a community network with a coalition who's really focused on different supports in that area. And again, it looks like, just at a quick glance, it looks like there's some overlap there. And if you can't find what you're looking for, feel free to send me an email. It doesn't look like I can send everyone a chat in the webinar chat. But either we can send my email address out later. I also sent a workforce development link to our website. We have a lot of really great resources at Rural LISC around that topic area. So maybe we can get that out to the group later as well.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I will try to drop in a report we did on natural disaster recovery and resilience. One thing I'll mention that we didn't talk about is, I think, both in incidences of natural disaster and in incidences where outdoor recreation is growing as a rural economic force, communities are often slow to recognize the displacement dynamics that can be developed anytime there is sort of new economic pressures happening in disaster recovery. Often, sometimes redevelopment can end up pushing folks out if it's not done well and kind of intentional. And we've found ourselves engaged with folks across the country in different regions who are both excited about the opportunities of outdoor recreation as economic development, but not recognizing that the natural sort of market default is more of a tourism economy that produces more local, low-wage local jobs if you're not really careful about strategies to build wealth locally and set aside land to make sure housing can remain affordable for residents permanently. And often that sort of only happens after it's too late. And so it's another issue I think we'll continue to work on, but it is part of that connection of sort of how we build even our rural places, which we often think of as somewhat like we're desperate to have people come there. The strategies about ensuring that folks get to stay and are a part of the decisions about how their communities are going to grow and redevelop are really important.
And I will say to our audience member in New Mexico that our Western partner, RCAC, has been very active in Mora for many years. And I know has been doing work both previous to the disasters and post. So if you go to our website and click on the Western RCAP, you can get in contact with RCAC. Also, there are some funding opportunities out there depending on the timing of the various disasters. I know USDA has their calendar year 2022 disaster grant funding that they're trying to get out the door, and we're a TA provider as well as the National Rural Water Association for that, but it is specific to communities and facilities that were damaged in calendar year 2022, federally declared disasters, and it's specific to water, wastewater, stormwater, and solid waste. So not all rural community development work, but those infrastructure pieces in particular. So I know we're over time. There are a couple of other questions. I don't know if our panelists can stay on to answer one or two more questions, or if we would like to close, but I'm open either way.
I can stay on for one or two more.
Okay, great. So another question, are you familiar with any national reports or data sets on the geographic distribution of private philanthropy? Wondering about a data case for investing in underserved regions.
I'm smiling because that's like the $100,000 question, or what would now be probably the $1 million question. There has been some work. I think actually McKinsey produced a report that had some philanthropic overlay. Andrew at the Federal Reserve Board is working on a report to try to get at least some geographic of where national philanthropy has gone, and we're hoping that he'll be able to produce that report and the Federal Reserve Board sometime soon. It's very difficult to kind of match up, both get the data and then match up where it goes geographically versus like who gets the grant. But I think in the meantime, I will note that Headwaters Economics has just put out a report that looks at where the federal funding over the last 4 years has gone. and the notion against a capacity map, so that recognizing that the lowest capacity communities have received less than, I think, 8% of the total funds. So that may be useful to your work, but I think we are all trying to find ways to make the case of why and how rural regions have really been underinvested relative to both the population and the demographic needs, like where persistent poverty is and things like that. So certainly we're hoping the Fed Board's report will come out, and there's a few other things that people have done anecdotally, but there hasn't been a definitive philanthropic report that I know of.
Yeah, and I will add too, and this is also more on the state and federal side, anything that has federal origins. We haven't done a public rollout yet, but we'll be doing one later this summer. But as part of RCAP's role as an EPA National Environmental Finance Center, we looked over the last 20 years where federal investments were made in water broadly, talking like water, wastewater, stormwater, and where folks were not necessarily funded, and then overlaid with a number of different maps, including, CGEST and others, to really show some of those disparities and some of those that continue to not be able to have access. So we'll be doing a public rollout of that in the next couple of months. So again, definitely specific to some of the infrastructure work and on the federal versus philanthropic side, but we're excited to have that resource available to folks as well. All right, and then our very last question, and then we will send everyone on their way. But the last question is, has there been any progress in reframing agriculture as an important pathway to our climate-conscious 21st century economy? Any takers?
I'm trying to read that, reframing agriculture. I don't think the way I'll take a stab at, I think what we've been thinking a lot about is to both understand that one, rural and agricultural are not the same thing. So when people think of rural, they just think of farms. And when they think of farms, they generally think of farmers versus the reality of mostly much larger corporate farms. And so the loss of the small farmer often means that many rural areas have food deserts, and as well as less likely to have more sustainable and low impact farming practices, because the corporate farm is much more geared towards volume. So I think there's a lot of stuff in that space around both how to promote small and support small farming, protect farmers and landowners, particularly farmers and landowners of color who've been historically discriminated both with access to resources and then lending, but also the food systems and food networks of rural regions, which it's surprising, but to think about sometimes that rural places often are food deserts. But when you think about the volume of people, it's difficult for grocery stores to support low density populations. And so food co-ops have become, I think, a really important strategy. I do think this is an area where the intersection with climate change and strategies around climate change need to go. I think so far we've been probably more focused on the energy transition because of the funding that's come out of the administration, with particularly wind and solar and geothermal in some places. But I do think that there is this whole idea of sort of where agriculture is going. And often we were just in rural Minnesota last week and 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about all the stuff that's grown around them where we were. And we saw miles and miles of fields with soybeans that was going to be exported to China. And so they were still having, it was more expensive for them to actually get fruit and vegetables and other food into their community for folks who live there. I know that isn't a direct answer to your question, but that's what I could come up with.
Ted, I think I saw your hand. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, the conservation title of the Farm Bill, I mean, I'm happy to share additional information, but there has been efforts over the last couple of bills to integrate more climate smart agriculture. And obviously our conservation programs. Conservation is voluntary, right? There's a plethora of programs at USDA's Conservation Service that works with farmers, and Climate Smart has been a part of that. And I think there has been incentives, obviously, through the Inflation Reduction Act and others to really help. And as Chris pointed out, there is a lot of corporate farms in the United States now too, but how do we both help corporate, but also help those small family farms and mid-sized farms, and making sure that the regional conservation stewardship program is there. And I know there's been a lot of debates there. So there's more information, but I think it's a great question. But the answer is yes, but doing it in a way that continues to promote that voluntary spirit that's been, enshrined in the Farm Bill for generations. So that's all I had to add.
Right. Excellent. Well, with that, since I know I want to be sensitive to people's time, just wanted to have a big thank you for all of our panelists today and our partners in this roads work that we've been doing over the last 4 years. And again, this is not the end. We're just transitioning into a new phase and are looking forward to continuing to work together and with all of you to make sure that rural is not left behind. And not only that, but that rural is thriving. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. We appreciate you being here, and the slides and recording will be posted, so you'll all have access to that after today's session. Thanks so much.